How's it going, everyone? It is I, Anime Outlet, and this is part 4 of What If Deku had the Byakugan. And now, before I start this What If off, I would like to ask all of you to put your What If suggestions down in the comment section below. And now, let's begin. Welcome back, class. How's your break? I hope you guys didn't stop your training, as you're gonna need it today. Since today is the UA Sports Festival, I know you all have been looking forward to this for quite some time now. So please go down to the loading bay, where you will then see a bus marked as Class 1A, and just stand in line there waiting for me to arrive there. Once I do arrive, you all can then hop on the bus and we'll begin the journey to the Coliseum, where the festival will be taking place. I would say this as all of the students would hurriedly get out of their desks, creating a lot of noise before going down to the loading bay, where they would then find the bus that was labeled Class 1A. Aizawa would arrive as they would hop on to the bus, as they would then speed off towards the Coliseum. Once they would arrive, they would all hop out of the bus, excited for what was to come inside this massive Coliseum building. They were excited to just be famous online after they won the UA Sports Festival. All of them were thinking up these opportunities and this certain just things that were happening in their head. They were thinking like they were going to win, as it was something that they all wanted to happen. However, there could only be one winner, and everyone there was trying to get such glory. So they would all walk in to the waiting room, as they would then get dressed into the PE uniforms that UA had supplied them. Many of them would start to stretch, as they had been taught to stretch before major things of training or battles. So when they were stretching, they would be called out to the field as the doors would open, revealing blinding lights and a very cheering crowd. As they would walk out, the crowd would erupt into massive cheers from what they had just been doing moments before. Many of the other classes standing around them would start to snicker, wondering why didn't the crowd react when they walked out like that? Those stupid Class 1A people, they get all the attention, not us like 1B or Class 1C people. Many of the classes would end up saying, as they wanted to be just like Class 1A, but many of them weren't good enough or strong enough to be in such a class. However, many of them had heard about the coward and weakling that was in Class 1A, and this, of course, being Mineta, and many of them saw his spot in the class to be a weak point, and so they had heard that if they perform well enough, they could possibly get into that class. So they all just started glaring at Mineta, wanting his spot in the classroom. So Izuku would be still stretching, getting prepared for the fight, as Midnight would walk up onto a podium that was situated in the center of the Coliseum. Good morning, everyone! How are y'all doing? Today is the start of the UA Sports Festival. So, let's begin with the first event, which just happens to be a race. The contestants here will travel outside of the Coliseum, where they will then see a straight line. And this straight line will have 3 different obstacles: mega robots, a pit of doom, and of course, just the minefield. So, why don't I lead these contestants over, and we can begin, as the crowd would erupt into cheers thousands times as louder as what it had just been while Midnight was talking. So she would get down from her spot at the podium before leading all of the students to just a tiny hallway where they were all just standing, pushing and shoving around to see what was behind that door. When the door would open, a massive cry saying "go" would end up being heard, as all of them would start pushing and shoving even harder to try and escape the pit of hell that they were in, being shoved up against each other so close. Izuku would end up jumping up, grabbing on to people's heads and pushing off of them, pushing them down in the process, causing Izuku to get out first. Todoroki, seeing Izuku doing this, would copy him, as Bakugo, not wanting to be behind, would end up using his explosion quirk to send people behind him in dust. Bakugo had seen Izuku and Todoroki and how they were just so strong, how they blended so well together fighting the Nomu, and he didn't want to be outdone. These were people that were weaker than him in his eyes. How come they were getting all of the attention by the rest of their class? This just couldn't be. He was going to be the future #1 hero one day, of course, and he can't have two weaklings or tiny little pebbles blocking his way, as these are tiny pebbles. He should just be able to kick them or flick them away, like he just doesn't care about them. How come they're in front of him right now? Bakugo would end up getting angered by his own thoughts and would end up using this to just become stronger from this. Using his anger, he would propel himself even farther, which would cause his hands to end up hurting, as he had used his explosions farther than what he had been able to do at the time. So, just sending his explosions into complete overdrive, he would end up launching right past the running Bakugo, or the running Izuku and Todoroki. Bakugo getting past them would end up revealing to see the first obstacle, a massive zero-pointer. Bakugo would end up landing before propelling himself off the ground, jumping up towards the zero-pointer, where its head would then be seen, as Bakugo's hand would end up going right down towards the middle of the zero-pointer's head, as Bakugo would then release a massive explosion, as he would then be sent flying back a little bit, as the zero-pointer would have a massive crater in its head, as it would start to malfunction before falling back onto the other zero-pointers that were remaining behind it, causing both or all three of these robots to just be destroyed. Bakugo would continue on to the second event, however, Izuku would end up grabbing on it to the zero-pointer, propelling himself forward, as he would end up being in a close second, and Todoroki being very close behind Izuku. Bakugo would launch himself even farther right over the second obstacle, and then right over the minefield, giving himself first place in this race, as neither Izuku nor Todoroki had anything that could propel themselves forward. Izuku did have his wind chakra nature that he could have used, but he didn't just want to use this. Todoroki also had something similar, but he wanted to save his energy, much like Izuku, for the final event, knowing that they were going to end up making it. So Izuku getting second and Todoroki in third, as the rest of their class and others would end up passing in the same way. So next, the second event would be announced after a waiting time to give them students a break. This second event would end up being the cavalry battle. So, Bakugo, having been announced to have 10 million points on the headband that he had, would end up being glared at and just thought to be just a joke. He wasn't going to survive with all these people hungry for the headband that he had. And so, when he would try to make up a team, no one would end up joining him. Only the few that were dumb enough to end up doing this, which just happened to be Kirishima and Kaminari. Mineta would end up joining this team as well, as he really had nothing else to do. No one wanted to accept him after the act that he had done at the sports fest, or at the USJ. No one in the class wanted to accept him, and with him not knowing who else was there, none of the other people that weren't in his class wanted to accept him either, as he was more of an enemy, as they thought they could just take his place with ease. So he would be forced to join Bakugo's team. As the event would begin, Bakugo would take a defensive position, just knowing that the teams were going to try to charge at him. Izuku and Todoroki had decided to team up, and with their combined points, they had sure enough to pass. However, they wanted to make sure others that were just as strong as them would possibly fail. So they wouldn't go after Bakugo. They would target teams that were right behind them in points and would end up seeing them going after Bakugo's team even though they didn't have to. So using them as a distraction, as they were distracted going towards Bakugo, they would sneakily grab the back of their headband before yanking, causing the people on top to fall backwards a little bit and the headband to loosen as it would come undone. Many of them were not the greatest skilled of people that could tie knots. So when them just easily yanking and it would come off, they would look back and see that their headband was gone, and Todoroki, Izuku, and their team was running off with it, as many of them were just in complete shock by this, but they were too concentrated on getting Bakugo, as they just decided, well, if I'm going to get the 10 million point headband, it's best just to disregard it, as they're just a small distraction. And this would end up costing many of the teams the sports festival and not going on to the final event. So the cavalry battle would end up finishing with Bakugo's team in first, having held off the rest of the teams for the entire time. Izuku and Todoroki's team coming in second, and the other teams would end up coming in third and fourth, which those teams, of course, just being the regular people that ended up making it on to the UA Sports Festival. The first round would end up being announced as it happened to be Izuku versus Bakugo. Todoroki had landed himself on the other side of the bracket, so Izuku knew they were going to meet each other in the finals. However, there in his way stood Bakugo, the person that had got first in the first two events. Izuku knew he wasn't going to get first in the last event, as they would both step up into the arena, as Midnight would tell them the rules, what a ring out was and what a knockout victory was, as she would then begin the match. Izuku would look over towards Bakugo to see he was already jumping right at him. However, Izuku would dodge Bakugo before grabbing his foot and slamming him down into the ground. Bakugo would then plant his hand on the ground before twisting his arm back, throwing an explosion right at Izuku. However, Izuku had dodged this and had then punched Bakugo right across the face, as Bakugo would slide across the ground of the arena, would then look up to see Izuku jumping right in front of him, as Izuku had a Rasengan in his hand before slamming it down right into Bakugo's face. Izuku didn't want to kill Bakugo, so his Rasengan wasn't that strong. Izuku could make one far more powerful as this, which could just flatten an entire row of enemies, as Izuku had his entire life to train his absolute hardest and had learned from some of the very best. So Izuku jumping at Bakugo with the Rasengan had just pushed it right down into Bakugo's face, as Bakugo would slam down into the ground, hitting his head, as he would be in a sort of dazed state, just barely clinching on, not wanting to lose like this, being in a blowout loss. So Izuku would see Bakugo just trembling down on the ground, looking over towards Midnight. Deep inside Bakugo's brain, you could see Bakugo yelling at another form of Bakugo. This would be a kid version of Bakugo staring down at the Bakugo that was on the ground. What's happened to you? Why are you acting like a complete corkless loser, standing on the ground to someone like this? He's only a pebble in our path. We should have carved through him by now. We're on our road to the #1 hero. He can't be standing in your way. As Kid Bakugo would be pointing towards Izuku, who was just staring at Midnight. How could you let this happen? You're disappointing, Bakugo. You're just like the losers you bullied all those years. As Bakugo would jump up, charging right at Izuku before slamming his hands together and sending a massive explosion right at Izuku. Izuku being caught off guard by this, it would be a direct hit right on Izuku, landing right on his shoulder as Izuku would slide backwards, clenching his shoulder in pain. Izuku, looking up towards Bakugo, would end up putting his pointer finger and the middle finger right into just sort of together before putting his thumb back, aiming right at Bakugo as Chakra. I'm kind of being confused after just finishing the Ultra Instinct series. So Chakra would end up channeling right through Izuku's hand as a tiny ball of wind would end up just circling right around Izuku's two fingers, kind of like a concentrated Rasengan, as Izuku would then launch this Rasengan right at Bakugo as it would fly in, hitting Bakugo right between the eye and the eyes, as Bakugo would then fall down to the ground completely unconscious, as this had broken Bakugo's nose from the attack, as Bakugo had just had way too much pain to deal with, just being completely knocked out. From then on, Izuku would then have to face Shinso in the finale, as there would be Todoroki waiting for him, having already beaten his semifinals opponent going on to the finals, as all that stood in Izuku's way was Shinso. Izuku had watched Shinso's battles closely, seeing him rise through the bracket. Izuku would see how everyone had lost, getting too full of themselves, as Izuku had realized that Shinso had some sort of brainwashing quirk that had something to do with if you answered one of his questions. So when Izuku would step into the ring and the match would begin, Shinso would start to question Izuku. However, Izuku wouldn't bite, not having that happen to him like the two people that were down below Shinso who had lost to him. So Izuku would decide to end this quickly and painlessly, as he would run up to Shinso and would go for a punch. Shinso would try to dodge this, however, Izuku would reveal in his punch a chakra ball being a Rasengan, something Izuku had used many times in his fight against Bakugo. So this Rasengan would then be slammed into Shinso's head, as Shinso would be sent flying out and would end up hitting the grass, being hailed as a ring-out victory. Shinso would grab the side of his head, but would reveal that it was painless. Izuku had merely used the Rasengan and the wind to just send him flying out of the arena without harming him, as he had saw that Shinso didn't have the best of abilities or one-on-one abilities, and so Izuku just decided to end it there, and actually ended up hoping that Shinso would end up being in his class, as Izuku had saw that Shinso's quirk had a lot of potential, and someone, this of course being Aizawa, would see this the same. So the finals would then be set. Izuku Hyuga versus Shoto Uchiha. I just decide to call him Todoroki because I like Todoroki more than Shoto, as calling him Uchiha doesn't really make sense when most of y'all know him as Todoroki or Shoto Todoroki, so I just prefer to call him Todoroki. So this final match would end up beginning, as Izuku would then just look directly at Todoroki and would ask for a good fight, and Todoroki would do the same. As midnight started the match, both Izuku and Todoroki rushed right at each other, slamming their fists into each other before going for a kick. Izuku would block this with the side of his arm, as Todoroki would then go for a counter with a punch. Izuku would end up blocking this, as the two would then continue on just trading blow for blow, each of course being blocked. They were almost in a stalemate, as they looked to be tied, as the entire crowd would be on the edge of their seats waiting to see who broke free and who would end up winning this match. So Izuku would end up jumping back, as Todoroki would do the same. Izuku would start to power up his attacks, as so would Todoroki. Izuku would do the exact same thing that he had done against the Nomu, but this time creating a water sword out of his water nature, as he has water, fire, and wind. Todoroki would then make a fire sword as he would rush towards him. Izuku would strike the ground, much like he had done with his fight against the Nomu, as water would then come up through the cracks, as it would then create into a wave, charging right at Todoroki, as Todoroki would do his best to hold it back. However, it was far too much for the fire that he had. However, Todoroki would end up freezing over this water, as Izuku would see there Todoroki stood with an ice sword in hand, having struck down the water, causing it to form into ice. As Izuku would look over towards Todoroki, as he would then charge him, hiding one of his hands, as Todoroki would do the exact same, charging right at Izuku. As Izuku would end up being revealed, there had his hand. It had a Rasengan in it, while Todoroki's happened to have Itadori in it, as their hands would meet, causing for it to connect together, as it would then cause an explosion, sending both of them flying backwards, as Todoroki would go a tad bit farther and would just happen to be a ring out, while Izuku was barely hanging on to the edge of the arena, as Izuku would be hailed the victor, as the entire crowd would then erupt into cheering. And that is where this part of this What If ends. Part 5 should be tomorrow, Wednesday, Part 6, Thursday, and Part 7, the finale, Friday, if it doesn't end on Part 6. Not quite sure how long this series is going to be. I thank you all for watching once again, and goodbye.